Hello, everyone. Welcome to the January 9th edition of the Scientific Governance and Risk Meeting. My name is Richard Brown. I am the head of community development at MakerDAO. Today, we are going to talk about some risk, and we're going to talk about some governance, but we're also going to do some interesting introductions. Let's do a recap of what's happened recently. We launched MCD. Okay, recap over. So what that implies, though, is that MCD was a big deal. It took a lot of work. It took a lot of people. It took a lot of planning. It took a lot of late nights and weekends. But happily, it's out the door. It's on chain and it's working. I hope I didn't jinx anything by saying that. But what that means, though, is that this has been a common theme at Maker for the last month or two. This is a time for reflection and auditing and doing inventories and all kinds of things and thinking about the future and what the future is a big nebulous thing that nobody quite understands and can't predict. But what we do know is without a doubt, the future of Maker is governance. Governance is critical to the future of the protocol. It's critical to the future of the foundation. It's critical to the future of the ecosystem, I believe. Maybe I'm being a little grandiose, but the foundation is going to be putting a significantly greater amount of resources, bringing a significant amount of resources to bear on the topic of governance, which is great news for us. It's great news for me. It's great news for the community, because that means that we're going to see more and more people from the foundation in these calls, bringing their own specific skill sets and ideas and initiatives along with them, and they'll be introducing them to the team and to the group. And over the next few weeks and months, we're going to be exploring ways that we can start really ramping this thing up and getting some more sophisticated tooling, some more processes in place, some more plans, making sure that we continue on this mission that we've never lost sight of gradual decentralization. It's critically important to the foundation that we continue to create this ecosystem for the commons, and then creating a healthy culture and a healthy community that's willing to and capable and interested in picking up the reins and taking over from us. And so that's going to require a huge amount of effort, and it's hard to, well, it's not hard to, I will overstate it if I can. That's what the foundation is about right now. So we need to ensure that we are the reference implementation of what governance looks like in the crypto space. It's going to be a big job, but we're basically halfway there, maybe 40% there. Who knows? Let's make up a number. But we're getting close to having governance that can bring us into the next, few generations of what the protocol will evolve into. So we've had these slow linear. Let's call it linear to be. Yeah, I'm not being overly optimistic. So we started out with how do we do governance? How do we communicate with each other? Where do we talk? How do we talk? And we iterated through all of these different stages in our development, from let's have a call. Maybe we should have a call to talk about governance. And then here we are with portals and proposals and forums and chats and votes and crypto media coverage and all the rest, and this huge crowd that we're talking to right now. So governance is bootstrapped. It's here, and what we need to do now as part of that reflection and auditing phase I talked about earlier is figure out how to take this gross, I was going to say to the next level. I'll do it anyways. How do we take this to the next level? How do we make sure that this is an efficient machine that gets everybody involved in the best ways that they possibly can, so they can express their ideas and help us to decentralize, which is what our goal is. It's what everybody's goal here should be, actually, but who knows? It's a diverse group. And so I'm not going to do a lot of speechifying today. It looks like I've managed to keep it under 5 minutes, so I'm proud of myself. What I do want to do is make some introductions. We have 2 new faces. Well, maybe they're not new faces. Let's just call them new faces for now. In the call today, they're going to be regular fixtures, so look forward to seeing them on a weekly basis. We have Derek Flossman. who is a product manager at the foundation. He's focused, I'm sure, like the rest of us, in a few different areas, but for the purposes of this group, he's the product manager for governance. So he's in charge of making sure that there's a tight interface between community requirements and the foundation responses to those requirements. We have Charles St. Louis, among his other qualifications. I believe he might have the best name I've ever seen in my entire life. But beyond that, he's also in charge. He's a technical consultant at the foundation, and he builds things for us and does some deep thinking and around process as well. And that's going to be something we're thinking about more, or we've been thinking about process since day one. But Charles will be bringing some dedicated resources to that process discussion. I'm not going to steal their thunder, though. I'm going to hand it off. Derek, do you want to take the reins first?
Sure.
Give us a little chat. Maybe introduce yourself if I didn't do it well enough.
No, it's all good. I liked David's intro there. That was good. I'll just leave it at that. Nice one-liner. Awesome. So what Charles and I were going to do, we were going to briefly introduce ourselves, and then, as you stated in the agenda, I have some slides that illustrate the emergency shutdown module, what that looks like, what the team is currently working on. So I thought it would be a good visual prompt to just walk you through, show you what that looks like, where we're going, and then a few other things. So I will hand it over to Charles to introduce himself, and let's hope the next button works. There we go. All yours, Charles.
Thanks, Derek and David and Rich, for the kind introductions. I just wanted to give a brief background on my kind of experience in the industry. So I initially started by working on a blockchain solution that leveraged Hyperledger Fabric for an identity, or mainly KYC and AML actually at RBC. I quickly transitioned to Ethereum for various reasons, and worked and advised on some projects during that 2017 craze. After that, I worked on security tokens and helped push forward the security token standard, ERC 1400 at Polymath. In terms of my commitment to the community, Ethereum community that is, I helped contribute to the Ethereum cat herders, working with network upgrades, growth strategy, PM processes, as well as helping get that ProgPile audit done. So my current role at the foundation is a technical consultant. I work on the engineering general team with both Lauder and Adrian. My main focus is, as of late, were the Maker documentation portal, so docs.makerdao.com. It'd be great if anyone could give feedback here, whether that be on this call or over Rocket Chat or Twitter. I'm always trying to improve that. So yeah, I worked on the technical writing and documentation for that. Additionally, I worked on the research and design of the Maker Improvement Proposal framework, which is still a work in progress, but something I'm really excited about in 2020. And lastly, I worked on product coordination and developer activity. Other than that, I think I'm gonna hand it off to Derek to give his introduction and show you a bit about what he's been working on.
Cool, thank you, Charles. Cool, okay, so by way of, my background, initially building financial trading applications, investment banking derivatives. I really enjoyed that space, but I quite liked the value add of product management, and so I transitioned to big data, search, legal tech, rules-based systems, and blockchain in general. And that was really driven by this desire to kind of complement technology with the social aspect. So when we start talking about things like liquid democracy, delegation, how that plays with technology, and how blockchain can really help sort of connect those ideas together in action is really what sort of brought me into this space. And my current role, product manager, as Richard said, at MakerDAO. So what I thought I would do, my role is very, I guess in some ways you can call it the glue between the different groups. So what I thought I would do was just give you a brief headline items of, what is that? What does it involve? It's very much encroaching in these other areas and working with these different groups within and outside of the foundation. So, and some high-level examples of that with the development team, building the ESM UI, something that I'll walk you through in a moment. Then also looking at collateral redemption in the UI. So this is once emergency shutdown has happened, how do we interact with the system? For SCI, for DAI, what does that look like? That's something we're building at the moment. With the design team for the interface redesign, we're building up personas. We're making sure that feedback from the forums, from the chats are collated and help us move forward in a way that's consistent. And you've already seen some of that with the MakerDAO.com site, and we're looking to extend that to governance and build up that brand, that identity. And then there's also other aspects of working with marketing to make sure that we have this, again, cohesive global approach and presentation of what Maker is. Then of course with the smart contracts team, so looking at instant access modules, making sure that requirements are documented. Of course, delegation is something that's been popular recently. So making sure that we have a document that encompasses that, and that ties in quite nicely with the Maker improvement proposals as an option, as a vehicle, a framework for presenting all of that together. And the Charles's experience in the MIP space with EIPs and things like that will be super helpful, super useful in terms of documenting, collating, and making sure that we have feedback mechanisms from the community, much like we do already with the forum. So I'm looking forward to that space very much. Integration team and partners. So there's custody solutions, there's integration work that partners have to work with us on, and there's developer guides that need to be done in order to support some of those integrations. And then of course, the risk team that we're all very familiar with, so posting weekly executive votes, and I'm involved in making sure that those get put on the site in a timely fashion. So yeah, at a high level, I thought I'd just mention those items. It's not completely all encompassing because of the different teams, but I thought it would give a good color to what product management involves and who we work with in the foundation. So to give you a bit of a visual, let's do a walkthrough of the ESM. So you all know it at a high level. Super quickly, it's a crucial security feature that allows the system to be shut down with the staking and burning of 50,000 MKR in the event of a high severity attack. Different ways to initiate emergency shutdown are through a governance executive vote or through the emergency shutdown module command line. And some of you may have noticed that, that when we did MCD, we put that in the module dropdown on the vote.makerdao.com site. And the plan is for us to transition that dropdown to this ESM UI. Hopefully, of course, we don't have to use it, but that is the plan, so that it is there as a security measure if needed. So the goal here is to have the dropdown where it says modules. Instead of going to the CLI text that we have today, it would go to this page. It would illustrate the total amount of MKR burned, the option to burn your MKR, and the ESM deposit history. And we've been quite specific here with the language that we've used, and the dev team have been awesome in this respect in terms of clarifying to me and others the severity, the impact that this whole process has for the system as a whole. So you'll see we've tried to implement some, making it very clear to the user the severity, the impact that this has as we walk through it. So pretty basic front page. Then are you sure you want to burn MKR? Again, reinforcing the fact what the user is doing. Giving them the option then to enter the MKR amount or set max and continue. And then an explicit confirmation. So illustrating the burn amount, the new ESM total, and then we've introduced a phrase confirmation to then really ensure that the user is willing to do this, and then unlock and continue. So on this page, as an example, you would see that, okay, I've staked 1000 MKR. You'd also see the deposit history. And this is in the case of, well, only one person's burnt their MKR in the system, but what if the threshold was reached? That would, as expected, be illustrated like this with an initiate emergency shutdown button. And once this page is here, it's available. It's an option that anyone would be able to see. You wouldn't have to be an MKR holder to view this page, and anyone with gas, with ETH in their account would be able to initiate that action. Of course, again, prompted with a confirmation message.
Can I jump in for a second, Derek?
Yeah.
Is there a distinction made between MCD and SCD here? Like, is this global, or can this tool support, okay, now it's time to shut down SCD, let's just shut that one down and not MCD?
So this is for the whole system. In order to shut down Psi, we would be doing a governance vote.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So it's going to cost the MKR holders to shut down the DAI credit system, but to shut down Psi, it's just a regular governance vote where no MKR is burned.
Correct.
Am I correct in saying that technically you could also shut down MCD with a governance vote without the need for 50,000 MKR being burned?
Yeah, that's correct. This is just a module to kind of sidestep that.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. And so last step in the process here, we have a flat page, illustrates the status, and we've got a banner on the top where governance will post meeting call information on the next steps. And I guess what I want to make clear here is that I'm just illustrating the steps to initiate emergency shutdown. And I think I've got some next steps in the next slide. Yes, so what we're doing now, completing the development of what I've just showed you. These were screen grabs that the dev team are working on actively now. And then referencing a lot of the feedback we've had over the last couple of weeks, getting a better definition of the post-emergency shutdown process. There's been a lot of back and forth, and I think there's some good scenarios that we can incorporate into what does it look like in these different edge cases. So building that up is kind of a next action item that I think would be valid to do from what I've seen.
There's significant infrastructure that needs to be put in place, like end to end, to make this thing work. Is there a general sense of when that this will hit mainnet? So
the functionality that you've seen here should be within the next, we've got it for the current sprint. So let's say sometime next month.
Yeah, cool, thanks.
Cool. And yes, so then I'm currently working in parallel on the collateral redemption. So in the event of emergency shutdown, both for single collateral DAI and multi-collateral DAI, what does that process look like? And again, I'll have a breakdown for you. I can show you the wireframes as we build those up and what the process looks like. So I'm hoping that'll clarify some of the questions I've seen with regards to, okay, I'm a DAI holder, I'm a Psi holder, I've got collateral. What do I do in that instance? So be able to work through that. So I also put two other items on here, the MIPS process. So working closely with Charles on that. And we'll be doing, yeah, as Rich said, a lot more engagement with the community around how that framework is built up and what it means. And then delegation voting I put on here because there's been some discussions around that, and I think it will fold in nicely with some of the recent discussion as well. So hopefully, oh yes, and some resources, and I can send this out to people if you are interested. So happy for questions, and we've got some of the technical team on as well. So if anyone has questions, feel free to fire.
All right, well, I'm not sure whether people were just scrambling for their mics or not, but thanks for that, Derek. Just as a reminder, we have a Q&A session at the top of the hour as well. So if you guys want to give what you just saw some thought, you have some questions, feel free to interrupt us right now, or keep them in your back pocket. We can talk about it at the end of the call. Charles, did you have anything that you wanted to add, or was that rolled up in Derek's presentation?
I think Derek covered everything. If anything comes to mind, I'll mention it.
All right, sounds good. I think that's going to be it for the non-risk portion of the call. I'm going to hand this off to Cyrus and the risk team to let us know what's going on with migration in the peg.
Hey.
Should I go ahead?
Yeah, you should go ahead.
Okay, just a sec. Okay, can you see this? Cool. So last week we had a bit a pickup in the pace of migration. So there's about 9.3 million more DAI now out there, and I think about 4.6 million SAI less in existence. So net, I think the total supply increased by about 5 million. So from 112 SAI and DAI, we're now at 117. So we've seen a bit of DAI and SAI minting in specifically over the weekend, and this kind of corresponds to ETH price increase that happened recently, and a bit more of leverage behavior of CDP borrowers in the last few days. Here is a chart for SAI draws or SAI mints, and I'm showing you the last few days, and you can see there was quite some minting also in SCD, which is particularly interesting. The blue lines here show the younger CDPs. So these are the CDPs which were opened in recent 30 days, which is interesting, and it shows there's a lot of users who are still minting SAI. Not really sure if this might be market makers providing some of the liquidity of SAI, because liquidity of SAI is actually pretty low. Going to show you that later. And I believe these users might be providing it, but they also might be speculating on catching some of the premium, right? If there's less SAI in existence, and these are ultimately the last SAI coins minted out recently, they could make some arbitrage there. Plus, there's a regular arbitrage to be exploited, right? So we know there's a stability fee of 5% in SCD, and the DSR now at 6% in MCD, and some of them might be catching this extra 1%, the spread. All them not really show how viable this strategy is. Keep in mind that these CDP owners, the last ones, which will stay, the SAI liquidity will get tougher and tougher, and less SAI will be in existence, and it's going to be much harder for them actually to get out of SCD until there's a shutdown. One other thing, talking about liquidity, is so here I want to show you. So this is the amount of SAI loans minted, or actually SAI minted in last month. The figure is quite high. I was quite surprised, but it shows you there's still some activity of borrowing. And we're not really sure how much of the current borrowing is actually done by these younger CDPs, who may be really just some speculators in the end. Talking about liquidity, specifically SAI liquidity, it's pretty low. So you can see in Uniswap, which is basically the only venue that's liquid now, there's only a bit more than 500,000 of SAI, so almost 600,000 of SAI there. The figure is quite low in percentage terms versus total supply, but Uniswap always had like 2 to 3% of all supply deposited. What's more worrying is that there are really no other venues now, right? Oasis, so the old ETH to DAI, used to be the prime venue. Now, if you want to buy SAI with Red Tether, the spread is high. It's almost 10%. If you want to buy 10,000 SAI, to repay your debt, you're gonna incur a high slippage there. So liquidity is getting much worse, but it's on the other hand much better for DAI. Another thing I want to focus is Ether locked in collateral. So if you count together Ether locked in MCD and Ether locked in SCD, I think the figure is at 2.4 million ETH, which is all-time high. This also improved the collateralization ratio. For MCD now it stands at 300%, which is some kind of long-term average. The ratio is also bigger because of the recent Ether price increase. For SCD, it's also much better than it was during the December. And that was in this occasion here, when we see a breakdown of collateralization ratios in SCD. Here was quite risky. So more than half of CDPs had less than 200% ratio. Now again, it's much safer because they added additional collateral and also because Ether price increased. So now it looks much better. The other thing is DAI and DSR at all-time high at 44%. As we showed last week, this was mainly because of Compound, which integrated DSR for its unutilized DAI. So in Compound, if we check, the unutilized DAI sits at about 10 million. So all of these DAI is now in DSR. Looking at Psi Compound markets, there's still 5 million of Psi left there. I was hoping to see this figure to go down more faster, but the thing is there wasn't really high incentive because the spread between Psi and DAI lending was only 1%, but now it's 3%, right? So I'm assuming some of these Psi suppliers should now really switch to DAI using the migration contract. So we should see some inventory there, unless these users are again some speculators trying to catch some premium if there's a Psi liquidity crunch. But I doubt it. It's hard to say actually at this point. Last thing I want to focus on is I did a bit of analysis on the remaining Psi holdings and remaining Psi borrowers. So these are top Psi wallets, the structure. These are the top 100 Psi CDPs. If you look at the wallets, there's now 35 million Psi in existence, and the top 100 wallets have 27 million of Psi, which is about 3/4 of all Psi in existence. So there's 100 users who hold 27 million. Actually, it's not 100 users. I have to correct myself. There's also Compound and this kind of pooled wallets. For instance, if we check Compound, here is the structure for Compound Psi. There's at least 100 users still supplying Psi in Compound, right? So I would say in total, about 200 to 300 users still hold majority of the Psi, so about 80 to 90%. What we also know is that there are some known addresses here, 7 million of Psi. They hold about 10 million of Psi. Most of it, again, Compound and secondary lending platforms such as Nexo, Nuo, BZX, Celsius, and so on. Also something held at Uniswap. Another interesting figure is 7 million of Psi that's being held by some wallets that were inactive for more than a year, right? And that's 20% of current supply. Probably some part of that Psi is also lost, but we're not sure what amount. And then on the borrower side, so 100 top CDPs, so Psi, single collateral DAI CDPs, they hold again almost 90 million of all debt. These are the CDPs. If you look at them, you know there's one big one still there. Its share is also almost 1/4 of all debt. It hasn't interacted with the system for about 6 months, and it owes more than 800,000 of fees, which is about 1/3 of all fees that are owed currently. what I try to do is to see how they behaved. More specifically, I wanted to see what were their type of activity during the migration, or what was their last activity type. And of course, most of them, I'm still guessing they want to migrate over, but they are bound by the liquidity and by the SI in the migration contract. So the wipe and the free activity is actually pretty limited, right? This is the structure of debt by the type of activity. So this is limited by liquidity. The other interesting thing was that most of them were actually locking or adding additional Ether to collateral in last month, and that was because mid-December Ether price dropped. I think, yeah, in the early part of December, and they wanted to protect their CDP because the only other option was to repay CDP, but if there was not enough SI, they couldn't do it, right? What's more interesting is that a lot of CDPs, like I showed earlier, they're still drawing SI, right? You have specifically some younger CDPs who opened CDP during the migration and minted a lot of SI. And why I think this is important is because we need to know how much of the old borrowers, how many of them actually migrated so far, right? It could be a bit misleading to say, you know, there's still debt out there and people, all of the old users didn't migrate, but it could very well be that a lot of debt is still is owed by some new CDPs, and we can see that by increased drawing activity. And as I said, these CDPs could be truly some speculators, but that might not be some organic users in the long term. So
Primož, I have a quick question. So this CDP activity structure is, what's the time period for this? This is over the last month, week?
No, these are the top 100 CDPs, and this is only their last activity type. So
okay.
it's a current snapshot of their last activity. It's actually hard to say what they did before they, you know, it's hard to say something about the behavior, but you know what was their last events type, how they behaved when they behaved.
So each CDP gets one input on this data. So if they wiped, it's their, yeah, okay, cool. Got it.
Yeah. And yeah, this is sort of interesting. So CDPs that haven't interacted during the migration at all, so this takes time into in the fact 40 of them, so 40 out of 100, they haven't interacted with CDP at all. And this represents 15 million of debt, which is half of this 100 CDP debt, or I think about 40% of all debt that's still out there. And I think that's basically it from my side, except for the fees. I just wanted to show that there was some pickup in repayment of fees. There's still about 40% left. Again, this CDP owing most of it. And I've noticed that there was some pickup in fees being paid yesterday, mostly in Maker. I'm guessing people prefer to use Maker for payments because it's much easier to buy it. It's much more liquid. And we'll see how this goes forward. That's basically all from my end.
Yeah, thanks very much. That was fascinating, actually. So you talked about how Uniswap is the last sort of useful liquidity provider. What happens when that begins to get down to the dregs, though? So I'm trying to figure out the cognitive and operational ecosystem overhead associated with maintaining SUD, and at what point do we start looking for indications that that ecosystem is no longer healthy? And I'm trying to figure out what those indicators would be. Is it's just simply that the peg is deviated and that's the final word, or is it once we see that the spreads have become unmanageable?
Yeah, I would say when peg starts, when you see some bigger trades happening over $1 and seeing some minters, this people who still use who still hold SI, trying to catch a decent yield. And yeah, so it's basically about the peg, I would say. Because keep in mind,
yes.
liquidity could still increase, right? If we see a lot of people still minting Psi and depositing it into Uniswap, I'm not sure how this evolves, but yeah.
So that, yeah, there's still going to be a demographic of people that are actually looking for that frothiness, and so there's the last. It'll be interesting to see what the last rush to the exit will look like. It's fascinating to watch.
Just to let everybody know, we're this is Joe Quinton. We keep a little reserve of side for liquidity just in case something gets out of line. So the foundation still has some side left.
Interesting. All right, thanks, Joe. And thanks, Primosh. I think Cyrus is having Zoom issues, so maybe I'll take over for him. Vishesh, do you want to tell us about the pegs?
Sure. I'll keep it brief too, because pretty much just went through is nice and comprehensive. Yeah, so just real quick, as far as DAI, we've seen today, even more so yesterday, some pretty solid 24-hour trading volumes. So there's been a fair amount of activity there. The spreads are interesting. So obviously, you know, currently centered around $1. You can see that, like in the last week or so, there was a bit of variation, but you know, overall, currently recovered back up to around $1. It had a few days ago dipped slightly below, but Psi again, and so yeah, here you can see Oasis kind of sitting at the center of that spread. DYDX actually picking up in volume, so that was interesting to note. And then Coinbase actually seeing more of a spread, theoretically slippage. Unclear why that's happening. Usually they just kind of sit around the middle of the price graph, so that's curious. Yeah, so just Psi, tiny volumes, as Primosh said. Theoretically still more or less on price, and Uniswap obviously dominating whatever's left of that volume. But tiny blips on radar relay. One thing I did want to note was, so the depth of some of these like charts for the trades that exist on the order books, pretty discrete amounts and very like balanced. So theoretically, that's the amount that's remaining in liquidity, as Joe may have alluded to there. I'm guessing is market makers, just kind of soaking up any last minute trades. So it really does seem like, and if you look at what's been going on in Compound, these volumes have come down. It does seem like the remaining amounts are more or less emptying out of the barrel. You can all debate how fast that's going, whether that's satisfactory or not, but it is continuing to more or less decrease, despite what's been going on with ETH price. And Primosh mentioned there were some new mintings, but yeah, I mean that all seems to be more or less fine. People can argue about the pace and whether that's satisfactory or not. Yeah, so just on MCD, so looking back, you know, this week, what some of the top vaults have been doing, I mean, more or less not a huge change in the top vaults, and their collateralizations have not really moved, so kind of quiet, so to speak. But as mentioned, that total amount has come up, and the total Psi amount has decreased. So at the end of the day, migration proceeding, and pretty solid increase in the amount of MCD. Overall collateralization was something else that I had here. So just, this is the graph that we touched on last time. Of the new kind of amount of, at least for ETH, MCD that's been added, that that collateralization ratio overall is still somewhat low. And this is kind of a question, is low relative to what, right? So it seems that this may have more to do with ETH price than some sort of change in people's particular risk preference. Because if you think about it, if a decent portion of these CDPs are, let's say at least 250% collateralized, in order for them to drop another, say 100 points in collateral, ETH would have to drop to a pretty low price. And I think this may be more about ETH price sentiment, that people are just fairly confident that it's not going to drop any further, and maybe less about a specific difference in people's risk tolerance in an MCD world versus an SCD world. And so it's possible that just the inherent fact that people migrated a large quantity of CDPs over from SCD to MCD, in doing so kind of refreshed the amount of collateral that the overall pool has compared to the overall amount of debt. And so it's now just kind of, in a going forward world, people have really kind of nestled in on what is to them an appropriate capital cost to bear for collateralizing their debt positions. So, it sometimes it's hard to reason about changes in behaviors, but this may simply be due to the fact that people made a change. And so when they made a change, they sort of spring cleaning on their collateral and have now nestled into a slightly lower collateralization ratio for their debt positions, because that's what they think is appropriate for the current ETH price path. Okay, so I think those are all the pieces I want to cover. I think Primoz got a lot of everything else today, but I'll answer any questions if people have.
Long and MakerMan had some interesting comments. Do you guys, MakerMan, do you have access to a microphone? Possibly not. So he points out the only remaining thing to do is align SCD stability fee to the MCD stability fee, eliminate the 1% spread. I don't know if you have any comments about that, Vishesh. It ties to the conversation that we've been having about DSR spreads, excuse me, in the forums and in these calls recently.
Yeah, I think that's something that people could discuss, but I'm not so sure that those fees are really a huge driver at this point. You could theoretically adjust the fees and eliminate the spread, and I don't see any problems necessarily with doing that. I don't envision that that's going to make a huge change, but yeah, I don't necessarily see any problems with doing that.
All right, well, it's a bit of a curveball, but it's also segues nicely into something that I wanted to touch on at the top of the call, but I forgot. I also bumped Long for Wisdom in my confusion. So I apologize to Long for Wisdom. But before we hear about governance at a glance, I want to put this back on everybody's radar, is that we have a signal in the forums that's been discussing whether we replace the weekly DSR polls with a spread, and from our own Sam/Hexanaut. That signal has gone through the paces in the forums, and it will be showing up in the portal on Monday. So if anybody wants to get familiar with what's going on, if they're not already, please look at that forum thread that I just posted in the sidebar there. Sorry, Long for Wisdom, I'm going to hand this off to you if you want to tell us about what's been happening in the forums.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. So, been a fair few active discussions over the last couple of weeks. Maybe a holiday, people have more time on their hands, or just interest picking up generally, not sure. So Hexanaut/Sam presented his governance model for Maker in the forum as well, subsequent to his presentation. So there's been some discussion in that on the thoughts about it and like alternatives and general suggestions. So that's been good. So we've also seen some continuation in the threads questions and discussions on emergency shutdown, which possibly Derek alluded to earlier. So yeah, if you're interested, go look on that. I'd also suggest that Derek and Charles potentially comment in there if they have some spare time. That'd be useful to put people's minds at rest. Let's see. So we've had a set of posts from Planet X describing a proposal of moving proposal related to collateral onboarding, suggesting that we use staking rather than sort of direct maker token voting, which has come up a couple of times in the past, but Planet X has done some pretty good presenting and theory crafting about what it could look like, which is really interesting. We had a discussion around DSR and stability fees by a character called Bit, so there's been some discussion there as well. And also MakerMan has proposed and discussed a couple of things, specifically adjusting interest rates based on debt facility utilization. So essentially changing stability fees as the usage, which is also a cool idea, which I quite like. So yeah, then as Rich said, there's been a couple of signal requests, chiefly some notes about DSR spread. As Rich said, that's moving on chain. This is long for wisdom. Hello. In response to the chat. So yeah, so that's going on chain. So yeah, as Rich said, read through that, etc. So another one that I'm going to try and convince more people to vote on is the how do we handle executive bundling in relation to technical changes, both emergency and non-emergency. I know it's not the most glamorous or interesting thing to vote on or think about, but it would be nice to avoid potential controversy or potential confusion the next time something comes up.
So hold on, I have a quick question about that.
Sure.
So so that was advocating for kind of the same thing that Sam was advocating for in his presentation last week, which is kind of one vote, one function.
Yeah, separating.
That whole idea. Yeah. Exactly. So it ties in really well with the whole question of like, how do we frame the governance polls? Like, should we be asking about a DSR spread versus like a literal amount every time? So yeah, just wanted to point out the connection there.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think like voting atomically, I think so for one thing at a time is generally a pretty important thing we'd have to figure out at some point. Obviously it doesn't mesh well with continuous voting currently, but we shall see. So there have also been signal requests related to SED shutdown, presented by Aaron Barch. So there's two more of those related to date and supply, so suggesting when should we shut down SED, or like what is the latest we should continue to support SED. I think 6 months is currently winning, which is interesting. And then also a similar thing for supply. So what level of supply at which should we no longer support SED? I think the winning option there is currently 10 million. So just some interesting thoughts. If you have views on those, I would suggest going and voting on the forums.
If it's 10 million, then you could reasonably expect that we're going to start talking very seriously about the shutdown, maybe within the next months, at this rate of like shrinkage.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting how quickly it's shrinking and how close this is getting. So, all right, I think that's me done, Rich. So, to move on to Q&A.
All right, thanks, L-Dubs. I'm going to keep on saying that until it sticks. That's the end of the scheduled discussions, I believe. I did have, so let's transition into the general Q&A and see if people have questions they wanted to throw at the team or anybody else who's in the call. One of the things to get things started, something that I've been thinking about is the concept of failed votes, and I'm trying to wrap my head around this. And it's a conversation that surfaced with with a few other people in various conversations recently, and particularly around the GSM. I'm just using that as an example. So here's the conundrum, or the thing that I'm trying to walk myself through, is we had this GSM vote. We talked about this last week and what the implications of the fact that that wasn't ratified are. But for just to recap, a couple weeks ago, a blog post went out, created a significant amount of urgency in the ecosystem that we needed to secure the system against governance attack. That governance attack being, in a nutshell, when you have a skin in the game voting staking mechanism for votes, there's everything when it comes to governance. Crypto is fraught with peril, but here's the one that happens with skin in the game. Just like the rest of the world, if you have a ridiculous amount of money, you can buy votes. That's what the shareholder type voting system looks like, and that was pointed out in the most dramatic terms as being like an existential threat to the ecosystem. So there was a flurry of activity. That activity was, let's give the community an opportunity to vote on the GSM. Lots of debates, lots of chats, lots of crypto Twitter activity, lots of activity too in existing large holders moving their maker to secure the current picture of the system against some potential governance attack, while the GSM was being ratified, or presumably will be about to be ratified. What actually happened though was the GSM was never ratified. We had this super secure existing executive vote. The GSM never managed to exceed all of that maker that was put into the system in order to secure the system so the GSM vote could pass. And then it got aged out because that's the nature of what continuous approval voting is. We can't have more than 2 votes at any one time. The next week, a new vote came along and bumped the GSM vote. So that's the context. The question I have in my mind is, what do we do in these situations? Because this involves a value judgment almost, or an interpretation. So do we say to ourselves, okay, the world was wrong. They should have voted in the GSM, and so we need to do it again? Or do we say that the GSM wasn't ratified, therefore the community didn't actually want it, and so we can now move on with our lives? There's a very strange distinction here between trying to determine whether a decision was correct or not, and the philosophical implications of this is pretty terrifying. So what do we do in that situation? Does the community decide, okay, well, we wanted the GSM didn't happen, so we're just going to keep on surfacing the GSM every week until it does happen? Like, is that governance? I'm not sure that it is, because at that point you're just saying, okay, we're not going away until you do what we want. Whoever we and you are in that model, I have no idea. So people who vote, I suppose. So these are things we need to consider. That's one aspect of it. The second aspect of it is, let's assume that the reason the GSM didn't go through was because I'm going to betray my own biases here, because it went out right before the holidays and people have things to do, and so there we go. That's the situation. And so there's a general sense that perhaps there should have been a GSM vote ratified. Who picks up that torch is the question. The second question that I'm wrestling with. And yeah, maybe I don't need to put a finer point on it than that. How does a vote come back? I'm not sure that we've discussed this kind of thing in the past. So I want to kind of just throw it out to the ecosystem. Let people stew on it, or we can talk about it now. People have, actually, well, people are chatting about it in the sidebar, so let's not do that. Matthew, do you want to talk about whatever you're saying in there?
Yeah, I mean, I would just assume that, for example, something like the GSM where it didn't pass, that it gets treated like, just bifurcate every month, that every other week we vote on monetary policy, and the other portion of that week we kind of somewhat vote on administrative items like risk teams or GSM style updates. And if something fails to pass, no different than any other vote, it just gets kicked back. We wait and get consensus from a forum, get it through a poll, and if it survives that, take it to an executive vote.
Yeah, but that's interesting. That still implies that some group of people have decided that the system had failed and or people are wrong. And so something needs to keep on happening until people are right or get it right. Right?
No, but
The
the way that can happen is if there's consensus in the forums.
Yeah.
Right,
Right,
and
so
I think there was even a recommendation from Mariano and maybe from Derek too last week, saying that eventually we do need this, like we do need the delay to not be zero. So for this specific issue, it would make sense that it has to cycle back. But yeah, I think it starts as forum thread, right?
yeah, it's the foundation. Like this has been on the roadmap for 3+ years. Like it's in the white paper, the plan to have a GSM, right? So, and we've been through the reasoning why it wasn't there at NCD launch, in order to retain agility against technical and or security fixes that might need to be immediate, versus the need to slow the decision-making process down by 24 hours, and so the ecosystem can come in and make some decisions. So obviously it's on the foundation's roadmap to do this kind of thing. It was supposed to go as a bundle with instant access modules and a few other safety guardrails like the OSM and a bunch of other things. So obviously if I had to guess, the foundation doesn't want to let this thing go. But so we need to figure out how do these things get surfaced and when do they get resurfaced, I suppose, and who's in charge of doing that. This ties into a larger issue too about campaigning, because who I guess let's just leave it at that. Who makes these things come back? I'm not entirely sure I understand what that is, right? So
I would view it very much like the bureaucracy of going through politics to get a bill passed through whatever country's Congress. If it doesn't get passed, it needs to have some type of campaigning and a bureaucratic process that joyfully goes through some type of, in this case, social consensus of a forum, then polling, and then push through. And in this case, for specific for the GSM, and I mean, all it ultimately does is it starts to slow down and adds inertia to the whole process of voting for all of us in probably a good way, where monetary policy gets spread out unless there's some type of emergency that forces some type of vote prior to that. But if you segregate all those pieces out, then yeah, I mean, if the GSM, if there's enough consensus from the community, including the foundation, then yeah, it'll find itself back on a poll.
Yeah, ideally, and I hope that you're correct. So we do need campaigns, and we need lobbyists. Maybe we need people that are willing to push these things through. But here's my cynicism coming to the surface again. This is a macro issue. It's human nature, but let's ignore human nature for now. Let's just talk about the way that the crypto works. Like crypto itself has this bad habit of every 3 or 4 months, some emergency rears its head, and then we all panic about it, and then we immediately forget, because who cares? It's only 6 months before we have to worry about an SH or a fork or blah blah blah. And this is the sort of thing that I'm concerned about too. This happens in a microcosm version of that happens in MakerDAO governance, where we need to fix cadence. We need to fix our definition of consensus. We need to fix the dead sin. We need to fix X, Y, and Z. And these aren't one-off problems. These are problems that recur, right? And we make a little fix. And then now that the clouds have passed and it's sunny again, let's not worry about it until the next time it rears its head. And the GSM might be one of those examples, right? So how that comes back to the surface without another overwhelming sense of potentially artificial urgency is the question that I have.
So does it make sense, like also referencing back to Sam's presentation about like one function, one vote, and I think I actually saw Matthew mention in the sidebar, does it make sense to expand the cadence of the executive vote to not just have like a weekly monetary policy vote, but perhaps do a monetary policy vote, technical vote, and like have like more of like a bi-weekly or tri-weekly or like monthly kind of cadence for the different types of votes, and that would also give us the opportunity to bucket those conversations, so we could have a lot more focused conversations on schedule in regards to whatever we're voting on that week, And if
Yeah.
there is an emergency or something very urgent, we can always supersede that set cadence. And then once we solve the urgent issue, we go back to normal or
Yeah,
whatever.
so cadence is a big issue, and that's one of the things that I think I started off or ended last year with oh yeah, my my epical list of I think it was like 80 different list items of like why I think that, should I say that governance is broken? No, what the challenges that governance faces in 2020, right? And one of those was the cadence. So we all decided that we needed to do a weekly cadence. And then we started running into these, oh, we have other stuff to do too in this MCD world of ours. And so let's just not do monetary policy every week. And so the question becomes, okay, well, if that's possible, then why were we doing it every week if we didn't need to do it every week? If we can move to bi-weekly or even monthly cadences for monetary policy and stuff, then we need to make sure that we're not grandfathering in processes and procedures and cultural norms, because just simply that's the way we did it in SCD, right? So this is one of the things that I want to, now that we have like more and more resources coming to bear, and the foundation is taking a super serious role in the evolution of governance, that hopefully we can start having these conversations. So if we don't need to be voting every week, then we need to figure out how often we do need to be voting on monetary policy, and then starting to figure out what our cadences actually look like. But that's also, and that's also another example of things that get surfaced and are important and we are interested in, but then we, for whatever reason, are no longer interested in because something else happens.
So this makes a good bridge into maybe Rich, if you could like talk a little bit about the governance poll that's going out tomorrow that is relevant to like Sam's presentation and the whole question of the DSR spread. Maybe like we could start there, because that's kind of like a step one. That's kind of like the next step in our community's governance cycle.
Sure. Let me clarify two things. It's not going out tomorrow. Like his thing is going out on Monday as a poll, and then next week, if that passes the poll, then it'll be attached to an executive. But this is a good example. Thanks for that, because Sam is actually the exception to the rule, because here's an example of somebody who came up with an idea and a plan and expended effort in the forum threads and fostered that idea and followed the processes and created the proposal and then made a slide deck and then came into the chat and then et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's a significant amount of work and dedication, and it's enormously admirable. But the thing that I'm trying to figure out is that what it takes to make things happen in this ecosystem? And if so, is that a reasonable expectation for the world at large? Can we expect SAMs to arise for the GSM or for the OSM fix or for additional oracles or for X, Y, and Z? Like, we have a lot of issues. And so I'm trying to wrap my head around how these things come back to the surface.
Yeah, I think it's really a matter of like establishing like a community known cadence for all these different buckets of issues at like some level, right? And also, I think just to correct you, some people are correcting you in the chat, Rich, that the governance poll for Sam's thing wouldn't go to an executive because it's just talking about the format of the governance polls in the future.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, well, there's some more. Yeah, okay. I see what people are saying. So there's other ambiguities here. So we have buckets or funnels, categories of votes. We have policy votes, we have monetary policy votes, and we've discovered recently that we have an increasing need for technical votes. Determining which of those things, which buckets individual things fall into is interesting, and which ones require ratification and which ones require or changes to the system and which ones just require consensus, eventual consensus. Is cool. But yeah, that is correct. It's probably just a poll.
I have one thing I want to bring. Go ahead, Rick. Go ahead. Go ahead, David. Go ahead, David. Go ahead.
It's all you, Joe.
Yeah, the one thing I wanted to bring up is this: I think we need to start, I don't know, planning out also new collateral types. We got to get moving. So this becomes even more decentralized, and we have the income about the collaterals, so we get DAI issuance up, because we need to have hopefully a goal would be like getting up to 500 million by the end of the year, but we need to have, in order to do that, we need to have all the collateral types that need to be voted in. So
Yeah,
that goes along with risk teams too. Yep.
That ties in nicely to the foundation's bringing far more resources to bear specifically on evolving governance as rapidly as possible, so we can hand that off and getting all these processes and on-ramps and onboarding collateral types as efficiently defined as we possibly can.
So is the next step like something like another collateral asset priority poll?
Nope. I don't know. Like, who knows? We still have a list. We still have assets on the priority list that we haven't gotten to yet. And so I'm sure the risk teams in the next few weeks will be coming up with additional insight into what's next for us. There's a lot on the table right now. We have a significant amount of documents and presentations and tools that they're going to be presenting to the community over the next couple months. We have a lot of governance stuff that needs to be cleared up as well. And then once we get that out of the way, we kick off, that official governance cycle that we've been talking about for so long. So just as a recap, or maybe just a refresher, that we're in sort of limbo right now. So maybe I'm stretching the analogy here. So we have the SCD universe, we have the MCD universe, and maybe perhaps connecting those two things, we have the migration universe. And we're still sort of in that migration universe where monetary policy needs to be focused on getting us from one place to the other. And that's where the vast majority of our time and efforts have been spent. But like I said, now that there's more resources available to us post MCD, we'll be able to spin off some additional tracks where additional collateral types become more important. But I'm reasonably sure there's still some groundwork that needs to be laid. Like, for a perfect example of that is that we're trying to figure out how often do we vote on things and what those votes should be about. Those things needs to be figured out before we have 5 different collateral types we need to deal with. We need to talk about instant access modules. We need to talk about a bunch of things. Yeah, so there's interesting stuff happening in the sidebar here. Can somebody, like I usually do the preamble at the beginning, but if you have access to a mic, I'm desperately interested in people just jumping right into the conversation and telling us what their ideas and thoughts are. Otherwise, David, can you call out some of these questions?
Yes, I read just the most recent one. Xenophon wrote, if governance is that important to the system, the foundation should hire people to make quality proposals. So I think the root of the question is asking a little bit more about what kind of additional resources maybe the foundation is bringing moving forward.
And I can speak to that. So this is a long conversation. And so here's some additional context. So the foundation is, depending on your perspective, and here's my perspective, the foundation its job is to create reference, the core protocols, smart contracts, and then reference implementations. And then those reference implementations are adopted by the ecosystem. And then we encourage the ecosystem to compete us out of the space, or we bootstrap the ecosystem to take over from us. And some of the examples there, well, they're kind of numerous, but I'm one of those examples. So the interim governance facilitator is a reference implementation of what a governance facilitator is. It's nobody's intention that you need to stare at my face for the next 5 years. That's we're here to create cultural norms, processes, policies, procedures, titles, all the rest of it, centralization mechanisms, and then I step away. Excuse me, and then a group of people from the ecosystem begin to take over, and the same model for Oracle teams, and same model for risk teams, and the same model for numerous other teams that will begin to arise. It's the same model for the CDP portal is a good example of that. So it used to be a CDP portal at MakerDAO, and it's not. We have InstaDApp, we have Varion, we have Oasis, we have all kinds of places. We have MetaMask, or was it not MetaMask? My Ether wallet. You can make a CDP in lots of different places now. You don't need to go to MakerDAO.com. And so that same process is planned for governance. And so the question becomes, so Xenophon, I'm actually talking about your question. I may not feel like it, but here we go. So the idea is that, yes, we do need high quality proposals. We do need people to do work. We do need people to campaign. We need people to do a lot of planning and processing and thinking about the system. That requires time and energy. And that time and energy requires incentives. And so figuring out how those incentives work is a big question. We've been talking about guardians, the concept of guardians at the foundation for a long time. And the idea ultimately is that once MCD, that engine is primed and fired up and chugging along, it's going to be generating, it'll be collecting fees. And once those fees are collected in the buffer, that buffer becomes the incentivization engine that pays for the ecosystem to do things. And so there's ultimately the idea is that people who are able to contribute to the ecosystem in a structured and sort of transparent / auditable community type way can draw money from that buffer and are compensated for their efforts. Until that mechanism is all fired up and running, though, the foundation's job is to pay for basically all that stuff. And that's what we do through the grants program and various other initiatives where we identify people that have shown interest and are doing things, and then we figure out ways to keep them fed. But right now, the primary source of these proposals will be from stakeholders in the ecosystem, so some brand or some org that's desperately interested in having their assets added to the system, or it comes from risk teams. Those would be the first ones I think that we formalize. I don't know if that answered your question, Xenophon.
Basically, we agree. We need people, and we need people to get compensated, and there's going to be a whole build up to doing that sustainably as a DAO.
Yeah, well, that's the key to the entire future of the ecosystem or the protocol. Our mini ecosystem is to identify actors in the ecosystem, empower them formally through governance, give them an identity and a mandate, and then ensure that they're compensated for their efforts, and which mechanism that takes and in what order, I'm not entirely sure. Right now it's through grants and subsidies and bounties, but at some point for the ecosystem to fully mature, it needs to what's the word I'm looking for? It needs to solidify into identifiable actors that are empowered. So we need to be able to say, okay, X needs to be done. Here's group Y in the community that has organized and has an identity, or at least the euphemism that we are, that's some kind of nom de plume that we can use to identify them, and that they are capable of organizing ways to manage their finances and coordinate with other groups in the ecosystem. It's a significant amount of work done. There's a lot of complexity that needs to be determined. And I'm also not driving that bus. And so I know what I've been told about that, but the details will be coming increasingly clear over the next few months. So David, like the things happening in this chapter, we should be aware of.
I think they're crystallizing around the idea that it's important to have a reward system and a reputation system, so that high quality stuff is most incentivized. But yeah, and just
yeah. So if people have ideas, who is it? Michael. So,
it was
who's talking about that?
And Long for Wisdom in the chat.
Yeah, so, oh yeah, I see that the libertarians are screaming. So well, I would like to hear about people's suggestions, though, because this is something that I've been interested personally in for a long time, is that how do we reward? So we already it's obviously easy to just, somebody says, okay, I want to do something, I think I'm going to be good at it, and figuring out how to give them money is not that hard. That's just the way the business works. If you want to put a crypto spin on it, though, that's fascinating to me. How do we reward people for being right, or for being efficient, or for having good ideas? And so we get into staking and slashing and incentivization mechanisms that are automated, which means that algorithms need to measure behaviors and tell us whether they were good and or bad. Those are fascinating discussions. If people have ideas about what that would look like, I'd love to hear it. Like the examples we've used in the past have been around risk teams, because those things, that's far more cut and dry. You can say like risk team X presented this proposal, and the assumption is that Y was going to happen in the next 6 months, and then if it does or doesn't, then we know we can like slash or reward based on that. But everything else is pretty ambiguous.
It almost sounds like. Sorry, Vishesh, go for it if you want to say something.
Oh, I was going to ask if I can pontificate for a second, so maybe you go first.
All right, sure. So yeah, I was just gonna speak. Can you mute yourself for a sec? I'm hearing double. All right, cool. So yeah, I was gonna say that. Shit, what was I gonna say? I lost my train of thought. Never mind. Hate when that happens.
Yeah, sorry.
Vishesh is going to tell us why he thinks it's a great idea that we pay him for being right or not.
No, I was going to say that's a scary world in which we start turning this into some kind of weird betting market where like you incentivize based on predictive accuracy or something. I don't know. But yeah, I was thinking about this more in the context of like traditional businesses and like how would a tech company think about these kinds of problems in the traditional world? And what is governance? What's the point of governance? What's good governance? And I mean, at the end of the day, if you think about this, like imagine this whole system was some kind of AI program that's job is to manage all these parameters well and make sure the system is functioning well and efficiently, right? You would define goals for it. And so you would give it a fitness function. You would say, this is how you judge performance is good versus bad, right? So you can decide whether that's based on some set of like risk indices, or whether it's based on maximizing revenues, or whether it's based on public sentiment. Like you can decide how you want to score performance of the system, but at the end of the day, you pick a set of values and you say, this is what we care about. And you tell the system, judge yourself based on that set of values, that benchmark, that rule book, and then manage the system to optimize for those values and do it in the most efficient way possible, with the least amount of negative outcomes, with the least amount of variance, with the least amount of overall cost. Like you decide what those negative values are as well, right? So it's value is essentially output for cost, and so you define what outputs you care about, and you define what those costs are, and you figure out ways to measure them, and then you just optimize for value. And so in that sense, I'm ridiculously oversimplifying the whole governance problem. But at the end of the day, that kind of is the point of it. And then your goal is to figure out how are you contributing to a system that optimizes value and doing so in an efficient way. And then you figure out different pieces, right, that contribute to different parts of that equation. Maybe some pieces are geared towards optimizing outputs. Maybe that is Rich. Maybe that's a governance coordinator. You know, something that is geared towards effecting outputs. And then you have other pieces that are geared towards maybe minimizing the denominator, right? So maybe the point of risk is to minimize costs or to identify those costs. And that's where I think using a traditional metaphor of like what would a tech company in a risk-driven business do, and how would they organize themselves to solve these kinds of problems? Well, you would have a set of, you know, analysts, data scientists, et cetera, that are geared towards providing resources. And their function is primarily a resource-driven function to make sure another function is well equipped to solve a problem, right? And that's usually a business unit. So usually a business unit whose ass is on the line to make sure that a goal is getting accomplished and being done in a reliable and predictable way with the least amount of cost. And that business unit has skin in the game, and whether it's in terms of commissions, salaries being on the line, whether it's in terms of them owning stock in that company, et cetera, in some way, shape, or form, there's usually some kind of buy-in where they are dependent on them, solving that problem well. And then that business unit generally has a demand on that analytics resource, that technical resource, that data science resource, whatever it may be. And then the performance of that resource is generally determined by the satisfaction of those business units with the resources they have on hand. And so, if the head of a business department goes to a CEO and says, hey, I am dissatisfied with, or I am satisfied with the performance of this resource, that's how that resource is generally judged. So I think, instead of reinventing the wheel all the time, which I think everybody likes to do, especially in crypto, I think just looking at how things tend to work in the traditional world is sometimes a helpful layer, so we don't overcomplicate things or reinvent things.
Yeah, I agree completely. I don't think you're oversimplifying. I think that you're adding like a necessary level of complexity to the system. And it's something that I've watched evolve over the last year or so too, is that our goals are slightly shifting. First was like, well, let's launch this thing and not break it. Let's launch this thing, not break it, and stabilize the peg. And then increasingly discussions around, well, maybe we should, I don't know, this is going to be, I'm overstating it, but like, let's look at this more from a business perspective than from a technical challenge of making numbers stay same as opposed to go up and down. That's how to figure that out and who's going to own that, and to shift our perceptions away from let's keep the peg stable to let's maximize burn, let's maximize adoption. There's other far more traditional business goals that need to be brought to the fore. What's that, Derek? Do you want to share that?
Yeah, just echoing exactly what Vishesh was saying, and that we've recognized this, and I think to Kurt's point as well, to focus on the outcomes, not just delivering stuff for the sake of saying, here, I finished the story, I finished the task, I finished an epic. Like have a clear identification of work that rolls up to the organization, to the foundation, to the community that we all agree on, and then have that work both come from the teams, bottom up and top down, and using OKRs, objectives and key results, where those key results are measurable and you can clearly see whether or not you achieved them, is something we're starting to do. And I think if we can get that in front of the community to contribute to, because essentially it's the team that has to own them, then I think that's definitely a step in the right direction.
Yeah, I think it's important to also, like, if you think about the context of OKRs, things have owners, right? And so functions that are tied to those outcomes are owned by a specific entity at the end of the day. And
yeah,
if you think about
sorry.
I was just gonna,
That's absolutely key.
In the context of governance, your goal at the end of the day is, to make sure that that system overall is crawling towards results that are in line with your values. And so that, to me, is the most tight corollary to a business unit that would be responsible for affecting those outcomes, is a governance kind of function. Now, whether that's a governance coordinator, whether that's somebody that's like a new piece that is specifically in charge of making sure monetary policy is going well, whatever that looks like, I'm not 100% clear on, but my assumption, my gut reaction would be that there is some kind of unit, some person, some entity that's responsible for driving good governance outcomes and defining and understanding, communicating with the community what good governance outcomes are.
Yeah, I think that you hit the nail on the head there, and that's something I talked about. I don't know, 20 minutes ago. We need to identify actors and empower them and define them and incentivize them, and because once we have that, then we've created an environment where we can have ownership and accountability, where people can be specifically tasked with certain initiatives. Because right now, what we have is an amorphous group of people that are casting votes through a web portal. And in that model, you can't say like, hey, business team, distributed business team one, you guys said this was going to happen, but that didn't happen. We don't have any of those things, right? And so that requires this additional layer, at least in my mind, an additional layer of empowered actors, people we can point to and have mandates and elect, and then have them do things.
Yeah, this conversation may very interestingly crash up against the whole conversation around delegated voting and all that.
Decentralization in general, right? Like, we're talking about the need for hierarchies in a decentralized crypto space.
I don't think decentralized needs to mean like no structure at all, right? We can have structure.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like Rich has kept everything structured. He's done a fantastic job. We've gotten this far, and we just have to just figure out a good structure for going forward. Which hopefully, Rich, you're leading here.
I lead nothing. That's precisely in my mandate. I'm not allowed to lead. I will facilitate, though. I'm hoping that leaders will arise, and then I can have less work to do. So. I'm imagine that Derek and Charles will be doing the lion's share of everything from this point going forward. So look forward to that.
Thanks, guys.
But yes. So we do need to, this is part of this ramp up and the additional resources and the audits. And these are the things that we've been talking about internally and externally for a long time. But and there's gone through different iterations where we need to have, the community needs to step up, or we need to empower the community, and then became guardians. And this definition of these groups of people that are responsible for specific activities. And I think the most recent nomenclature are DAO teams, and so we need teams of DAOs out there that are doing things, and we need to figure out how to create those reference implementations of those models and those incentivization mechanisms to get them engaged in the system so we can begin to transition. So an example of that would be to go back to how I'm not going to be leading anything, is to figure out how to identify other governance facilitators in different geographical regions and bring them online, and then have a interim governance facilitator committee. And then these governance facilitators can work together for a while. And once everything's up and running, then I can step back, and then we can have some new faces. And the model is slightly different with the risk teams, I think, but we need more risk teams. And once there's more identified, empowered actors that have been mandated, ratified, and have mandates and been ratified by the community, then we can start pointing at people. And then once we bootstrap those structures, then we can all decide together that, you know what, we need Vishesh to head up the business team to make promises about the success of the system, and then we'll pay him based on those successes. You were volunteering, right? Is that what
I already addressed that. I preempted you in the chat. No, I mean, I think that's a very important wrong answer right there. And I do think that's kind of my point, which is that's so not how you should be thinking about it. I think there needs to be someone, like some layer that exists outside of risk teams that is making, it doesn't have to be one person, right? It could be a decentralized function, but that is making a call on what resource to use when, and which resources are good or bad, and which resources, like which answers are right or wrong. Because like even in the context of risk analysis, etc., many people will come up with many answers. You have to have a layer who's got skin in the game to identify which answers are right versus wrong, which answers you want to use versus not use. And
Well, sure. I should clarify in case people are unaccustomed to my level of facetiousness. I absolutely was not suggesting that risk teams should be the people that would do something like that. I think that risk teams, and I'm not going to speak for you guys, but they come up with tooling and methodologies and frameworks and concepts that set the stage for people to make their own decisions about. So the risk teams are not going to be the people that are saying do this or do that, just like interim governance facilitators or governance facilitators in general are not here to say to people do this or do that. We're fundamentally not. Like, we're moderators. It's the job of the community or other very specifically empowered actors that that arise from the ecosystem to make those kinds of decisions. So I just want to clear that up, Vishaj. Exactly. Risk makes the sharp tool. Somebody else needs to wield them. All right, we're at, well, holy crap. I was scared that nobody would have anything to talk about today, but we Q&A'd for 34 minutes, which is great. But we all have jobs, and even the people that are in this call, I'm reasonably sure, are hiding in a storage closet somewhere. They should be doing something else. So let's call it there. Thanks everybody for joining. Please join us in the forums. That's where the interesting conversations that we've been having, like the ones today, get crystallized and turn into actionable items. So please join us there. Have a look out for Sam's thread and his presentation. Get up to speed on that because the poll is showing up next Monday. And thanks, Derek and Charles, for your presentations as well, and Primosh and Vishesh. And the guy I forget every single time, Lon, for listening. Thanks, guys. All right, bye, everybody.
Everyone. Hey, Rich, real quick before you exit, I have a quick question. And I was gonna ask it, but I'm not sure, like, the status, if you guys are already thinking about it, but is there, like, some development going on around the like an active governance like calendar that anybody can kind of like put on their Google Cal or iCal or something like that, that would have maybe like a maintenance schedule every week or like bi-weekly or something like that? Has that been talked about? Has that been like...
What do you mean maintenance?
Like if we have like a public governance calendar and we have like expected votes coming up, like everything would be basically listed there, and then eventually, like, if we have like a cadence kind of structure, you'd be able to like see it clearly on the calendar, but like something that's like a central reference point for like the governance community.
Yeah, we do. This is where we run into these problems with discoverability and things and such like. But yeah, every single notice that goes out includes a link at the bottom to the governance calendar in Google that you can add. If you actually click on the dates, it'll boost open a Google Calendar. Okay. But yeah, so this is something in community development. So like my other 5 jobs we're dealing with is how do we add some discoverability to some of the tools we have out there. But yeah, I just posted a link in the sidebar. If people click on that, it'll add our calls to your Google.
Nice. Thank you.
All right, then. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to tell Robot Lady to stop recording. See you guys next week.